back to your question, I was still there in Bloomington working, and then kind of hanging with Kenny, studying with him and trying to learn as much as I could. And there was an artist, John Eddy, who was on Columbia. It was sort of like a Springsteen-esque artist. Was on Columbia, signed. He was making his second record there at Mellencamp Studio. And when it was done, John Eddy needed a drummer, and so that's anyway. I moved out to the East Coast through that gig, and was then sort of in Jersey and hanging out. So that's how I got out here. I didn't go back home. I was lucky enough to move to New York with the gig.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then that was part.
No, sorry,
that was sort of down in that Jersey thing, like the Stone Pony and that whole scene in Philadelphia. And there was a whole East Coast scene that we played. And then that second record, I think it barely came out. It was a lot of drama. He was managed by Tommy Mottola, who and there was a book called Hitmen that was all about like sort of, the mob thing with the music business thing, very, very complicated. And so got drunk from Columbia, and then we got picked up on Elektra, and we made a record up at Bearsville, and Neil Young's producer produced it. I saw like, $300,000 going to this record, and then Elektra decided not to put it out. And that was sort of how that then fell out. But so I was on the East Coast, living in Spanish Harlem, with a girlfriend, and freelancing, and playing a lot of blues gigs in Jersey, and then singer-songwriter gigs at the Bitter End.
Bitter End. Oh, I love the Bitter End. That's one of my favorite places in the city. I had Richie Kanata from Billy Joel. He's the house band at Bitter End. He was on the show a couple months ago. Richie is freaking amazing, and I love. Have you ever been to the Monday night shows that they do there with the house band?
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, Richie, that whole scene down there is great.
Bitter End's incredible. But anyway, keep going. Sorry.
Well, so back then, that it was still a very vibrant scene on Bleecker Street, sort of with all of a lot of singer-songwriters doing showcases and people trying to get signed in the early 90s. And that's what sort of led to the SNL audition. Was I knew the bass player, Paul Asolo, was a great bass player that was in the SNL band, and Matt Chamberlain had done it for a year and decided to move on. And so there was an opening, and G called Paul, the bass player, said, "Hey, do you know anybody?" And so there were some auditions with some different guys. And but from freelancing, I was able to move out here with the gig, which was incredibly fortunate. And then sort of the freelancing thing, New York, the community of freelancers and kind of word of mouth thing is what led to the audition happening,
Mm-hmm. And were you at any point thinking, like, because now the first thing gets dropped by Columbia, and then Elektra doesn't decide to put the record out, and you're freelancing. Were you ever considering a point? Was ever like a nervousness about it? Like, oh, I came out here, I'm really going for it, but I'm getting punched down one after another. Is that kind of the way you were thinking, or are you just kind of thinking like, you know what, just it's a slow slope, and I just kind of have to ride it out as I do it?
No, it was dismal at times, as far as like, man, I remember coming back from a blues gig in Jersey at like 3 a.m, coming through the Holland Tunnel. And this was in the early 90s when the crack epidemic was happening in New York. And I shared a place with that guy Everett that's talking about, the percussionist now that is Springsteen and Bon Jovi and all these people. Anyway, so we had a place together on 14th Street. And man, it was really stressful and dark. Like it'd be 3 a.m. They're selling crack right there out of my doorstep. People used to sneak in, and like once somebody took a duty, in the lobby of the thing, man.
That's such a New York thing, just to say like, oh yeah, someone took a crap in the lobby of my apartment. That's so New York.
And I always thought I was, going to get ripped off with my drums, because I had to walk them up to a 3 flights, and then like sort of lock the thing in, and had this little truck with a camper thing on the back, like that had been all smashed in. Truck ended up getting stolen off the street. And uh, but the crack dealers didn't want to really cause any crime where they were selling this shit, you know.
Hmm.
So I never got ripped off there. But um, man, I remember coming back once and just thinking, man, this is, you know, these gigs would maybe pay $70 or something like that, and then if you were lucky and had a club date, wedding gig, you know, that would be a little bit more on the weekends and stuff. And I was making rent, and it was happening, and I mean, it was exciting time because the music was I was still really inspired about New York, and the thing about New York where it just like kicks your ass and kicks your ass and makes you stronger and it kicks your ass, you know. And so I was still cool to deal with all that, and I was getting some better gigs, and it seemed positive. But there were other times where it's like, man, you don't, you know, as I was in my late 20s, because I got SNL when I was like 29 or 30, and I thought you don't have health insurance, you're barely making, you know, you're barely just covering rent every month. Like there was no way I could envision like, oh, I'm going to have a family and buy a house and, you
Hmm.
know, support my three children that go to college. You know, it's like, man, the reality and the harshness of surviving in New York, you know, as a freelance drummer, I mean, it's a bitch, man. I mean, it
What's
is a bitch.
what's the closest you ever got where you're like, screw it, I'm not doing this anymore?
I never felt that. That's what's interesting is that I was like, I don't, it I don't know how to say it. If it was like, oh, well, it inspired me to just toughen up. Like it was more like I knew it was what I was doing. And like if I was going to be, you know, I'd sort of come up before I moved out here, like in Indianapolis, like I sort of played a lot of jazz gigs and that whole, you know, that whole lifestyle of like playing for the door or a tip bucket or maybe making $40, you know, all that. Like I was sort of kind of used to living. I mean, you know, like on 14th Street, me and Everett used to take futons that people would throw away, and that was our bed. You know, like I mean, I'm not trying to glamorize it. You know, it was just like, uh, you know, and we made macaroni and cheese and put tuna on top of it. You know, that little and but I never crossed my mind that I was gonna give up
Hmm.
or not even give up. It's more like I felt like this is what I do. This is what I am. And that hell or high water, I'm a musician, you know.
Yeah.
But I would never say to someone, come to the land of milk and honey and be a drummer in New York or something, you know, like, I mean, there's always room at the top for people to come and, you know, America's built on dreams and all that. So I don't want to sound dark and negative, but I will tell you, it is a bitch. I mean, the music business is a motherfucker, you know.
Yeah. Well, and when you're taking, futons off the street and, you're just barely paying rent, were you thinking in that time like, man, I'm living rough right now? Or was that not even a thought? Was it just like, I'm just doing what I have to do and this is normal. This is just New York City. This is how you make it.
Um, you know, at the time, I was sort of all in on this thing that, like, man, this is the shit that makes New York drummers crazy and puts that fire in their eyes and shit. And you know, I sort of had talked myself into swallowing all that hook, line, and sinker. I do think there's a little bit of truth to that. You know, like the edge of whatever you've got to do to survive and make it happen in New York, and the skill set you've got to pull together, and all the various things. And it does bring, you know, a certain edge to one's thing, you know,
Hmm.
and how you balance all that out. So I sort of like, I kind of, you know, I remember reading about like Elvin Jones talking about surviving on a can of sardines and how that had as much protein as eating a steak and da 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 and da da da, and you know, and cats making it happen, you know, one way or another, and how to actually survive you really need a ton of bread. And so I was sort of all in on the passionate journey.